So the next attack I want to talk about is the confidentiality attacks with DNS. Now, typically, DNS records are public, right? Like you want people to know that what the entry is. In fact, you want to broadcast it as much as you want because you don't want people to have to look, as a server, you don't want to have people asking you all the time what your IP address is. You're like, here's my IP address, go ahead and share it and cache it and spread it around. So confidentiality was not really a requirement in DNS. But as it turns out, if you as a user want to keep your DNS lookups private, well, then it is a confidentiality issue. So it's not necessarily a secret, those entries from the server side, but from the client side, you would like organizations to not be able to see all of your DNS lookups. And this is especially the case is if you're sort of in a repressive or authoritarian regime, and they're monitoring that to basically act upon and jail activists, for example. And so that's what this animation is getting at. Everybody can see who is asking for particular names in the network. So there are multiple strategies for performing encryption on DNS. The first is DNS over TLS, or DOT. And so I'm going to first talk about how we secured HTTP. So HTTP on port 80 was initially a plain text protocol sent in the clear on top of TCP, which was on top of IP. And then we were like, okay, we need confidentiality and source integrity and data integrity on top of what HTTP provides. And so the next thing that happened with HTTP was HTTP over TLS. And if you look at this protocol layer, we have this standard transport layer security piece. And this piece, you can layer any application protocol over TLS, and it will get security. It will get that confidentiality and integrity on top of that layer. You don't have to re-implement that security code underneath. So that's what we have. And this is basically prevalently what we have right now. We have HTTP on top of TLS, on top of TCP and IP. So DNS is similar. We have DNS, and DNS can go over TCP or UDP, and that's on top of IP. And this is all sent in the clear. And so DNS over TLS was like, oh, well, that's a good approach that HTTP took. Let me do the same thing. So DNS over TLS, or DOT, is a standard protocol for taking DNS, having it run on top of TLS, and then over TCP and then IP, or TCP or UDP, because DNS can run over both, and then over IP. Okay, so that is the initial one way of securing DNS, and that's just to use TLS. Option number 2 is this DNS over HTTPS. And so what DNS over HTTPS is that rather than do the thing that's on the right, you would instead run DNS lookups over HTTPS directly. And then HTTP is over TLS, and then and so on. So here's a question: which one should be used, and what would be the difference between using one versus the other? So I'll leave that open for a little bit, because this is something you should think about. Why do we have one? Why do we have 2 of these things, and which one would you rather use is the question. Anybody?
The difference between using 4.853 and 4.43?
Yeah, like what would be,
4.43 is already pretty saturated with web traffic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why you put DNS through the same.
Yep, there's one. You're like, well, why are they all using HTTPS? I have name traffic, and all of a sudden, I can't. It's all layered on top of web traffic. So that's one of the observations. So that might be a drawback, or it could be a benefit. It could be either, actually. It depends on who you are. Who would want to mix DNS traffic with web traffic is the question. sneaky people.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you're trying to like just hide packets in a very like busy channel.
Yep. So if you don't want people to snoop, maybe you would do, hey, I'm gonna put this all over web traffic, and then you're gonna have to do something else to separate the web and the DNS. Who might want them separate? Do you think anyone would want them to be separate? Who would prefer dot over don't? Just to get you to think about this.
I guess just network administrators.
Network administrators. And that is basically the dichotomy here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about DNS over HTTPS, or DOT, which is basically Homer Simpson, the protocol that Homer Simpson would love. So this is the DNS resolver lookup basically happens exactly as it did before. So you're actually not changing the backend, like you're going to have the resolver query the root, the TLD, and then the name server. What's going to change with DNS over HTTPS is this step, where the client wanting to do a resolution, instead of using unencrypted DNS to query this resolver, this local DNS server, it's going to create an HTTPS connection to the resolver and then send the query that way. And so then you get confidentiality via HTTPS between the client and the resolver, and then you get data and source integrity when it comes to source integrity for the resolver, that is. The data and source integrity is between the resolver and the client. And that's what you get with DNS over HTTPS. Here's an example of how you would change your lookup on the client to do DNS over HTTPS. Rather than doing a name resolution as you would before, you could just curl the URL for, so say this is your local DNS server. I'm just going to go to basically a REST API endpoint. And I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to hit this DNS query endpoint, and this is the query. I want to look for this domain with this, this DNS record type. And then as a response, you would get some JSON as a response, and you would get this A record to be 131.252.220.66. Okay, so that's DNS over HTTPS. So why would you use one versus the other? Well, with DOT, you have separate web requests and DNS requests. So you can clearly identify name lookups from web traffic. And this is good for network operators and IT staff to be able to classify requests and analyze them separately. And so if you have someone who is doing abuse using the DNS record name system, you can actually filter out, you can identify those lookups as DNS lookups, you can analyze them, and then you can filter out the known bad stuff. And it's much easier if they're running on different protocols. The other thing is that the operators themselves can do some security to make sure that the DNS infrastructure that they run isn't being hijacked or spoofed. But DOT traffic, because you can easily filter out known malware domains, you can easily filter out known domains that you want to censor. So this is good for censorship regimes, because then they're like, oh, I will just filter out all of those Facebooks and YouTubes of the world, because I don't want my people to see that stuff. Okay, so then again, it depends on who you are based as to whether you prefer one versus the other. So it's not an open and shut case in this casting, at least. So with DNS over HTTPS, you can the user can completely bypass the network operators and basically hide all of their DNS lookups in things that look like web traffic. So this makes it much harder to censor particular domains from the network. So this prevents the hostile government from easily blocking particular DNS lookups. Because in order to do so, they basically have to block all of HTTPS, right? Unless they find a way to break and inspect the HTTPS. But one of the things that happens with DNS over HTTPS is that you're putting your lookup and you're putting trust in your lookup potentially somewhere outside of your organization. So the people running these DNS over HTTPS servers are typically places like Cloudflare, Google, OpenDNS, these sorts of external providers. And then you would have to trust them rather than your network IT staff or your ISP's IT staff to maintain the infrastructure. And so then the question is, well, who do you trust more? Do you trust Cloudflare and Google? Do you trust Portland State's IT staff? That's a good question to ask.
So if you were trying to get around the DNS by encrypting it with HTTPS, wouldn't the packets you send out still just have a destination of 1.1.1?
Yeah, so all the packets. So if 1.1.1 is a well-known resolver, then you could say, oh, that's easily filtered. But it could be the case that I run a web server that also allows you to, like, I proxy requests for DNS lookups as well as deliver web content. And then it would be difficult for you to filter out, you know, if for example, if Portland State pdx.edu had a REST API endpoint for DNS resolution, then me going to portlandstate.edu, I could send a request for the web homepage, but then I could also ask for a DNS lookup. And then it would be difficult to separate those two because it's the same IP address, same HTTPS, and I can't peek into that as a network operator. So, yeah. Yep. So there's a battle, dope versus dot, and these are some articles about this. And there, yeah, you get, I mean, depends on what your perspective is on all of this as to whether you strongly believe in one or the other. But this is kind of like a dogmatic religious battle now in the back end. But we do have kind of a winner. And the winner is the whatever the web browser decides is going to win. And Firefox, because Firefox cares about privacy, and so the Tor, we'll talk about the Tor anonymous network at the last week of class, but they really care about anti-censorship, about privacy, and they choose DNS over HTTPS exactly because of those reasons. And if it's in the browsers, well, then everyone's going to use it, right? Like, you're not going to basically change the way lookups happen in your browser. I mean, many of you don't even know how the thing is done. So yeah, the browser, whoever controls the browser is going to control who wins here. And it looks like DNS over HTTPS is going to win. Okay. Questions about that?
So can a network administrator detect which browser you're sending packets from?
So you could fingerprint the browser potentially. If an administrator really wants to zero in on hosts that might be using DNS over HTTPS and then try and like block them, yeah, you could potentially fingerprint that kind of traffic. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways like timing analysis, packet size analysis, destination analysis in terms of, oh, this small request to this resolver precedes a longer web request all the time. Then you can kind of say, oh, that must be using DNS over HTTPS. Or if that resolver, all it does is send very tiny HTTP responses and it doesn't ever serve a page, then you're like, okay, that might be DNS over HTTPS. So yeah, there's always ways to reveal it, but you have to try harder in order to reveal that traffic. Yep.
Say suppose an administrator is going to, as you told, fingerprint the DNS. How do you validate that?
As the administrator trying to snoop on the DNS request, the HTTP, you can't validate it unless you break encryption, right? Because that's the end-to-end encryption piece of that. So if I am going to Cloudflare with this DNS over HTTPS, Portland State has difficulty figuring out what my request is unless they can break the TLS encryption. Yeah. You know, they might see 1.1.1, like they see packets going to 1.1.1, and they're like, hey, that's probably resolver traffic, right? Just because it's such a well-known resolver, but then I could put that somewhere else, and then it would be a little bit harder. Yeah. Okay, the next attack is also a privacy one, because if I use a resolver like 1.1.1.1, they have all of my DNS history, right? They know exactly what I have looked up over time, and maybe I don't want them to know either. So I don't want the network operators to know. I don't want the Cloudflares or Googles to know. Cloudflare says, oh, if you use a lookup on 1.1.1.1, we only keep the history of lookups around for 24 hours. That is one of the things when you look at using that resolver, they're like, yeah, we drop the history after a day. You have to trust them at their word, right? And you have to trust that the government hasn't forced them to retain those records longer. That's the issue, because if we do have federal law that says you have to keep this history around so that we can actually do our law enforcement activities, they might have to keep that data around longer. So then you're like, well, if I truly want to have privacy, what can I do to ensure that? And so let's talk about DNS privacy. So unmodified, everyone sees your lookup. DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS, the local DNS server is going to log your lookups and have a history on you. And then you're you are trusting them to delete your history in order to make sure you maintain your privacy. So if it's pointed to an ISP, so if the local DNS server is hosted in the ISP can log your lookup. If it's pointed at an organization, so Portland State resolvers or Portland State local DNS servers, regardless of whether it's DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS, if they are hosting the lookup, then they can log your lookups. And then if it's 1.1.1.1 or 8.8.8.8, then either Cloudflare or Google can log your lookups. And so that is a problem that Apple wanted to solve. And so Apple proposed oblivious DNS a couple years ago. And it basically decouples the DNS request from the local DNS server so that the local DNS server doesn't know the actual content of your query. So basically, even though they know you, so the local DNS server will know you, but not the query that you send. And then this query will get processed through the hierarchy. You'll get an answer, and then the answer will be encrypted so that the local DNS server won't know the response of the query and will send it right back to you. This is basically a preview to what Tor does with their onion routing. And so this is much simpler to understand than Tor. So this is a good warm-up for the last week of class when we talk about Tor. Okay, so what is going on here? So basically, there are two pieces that get added to this lookup. You have this oblivious DNS stub that is resident on the client machine. And this is going to provide the encryption underneath transparently. So the client, you don't want to modify. You're like, oh, I'll just take in a DNS request. But underneath, this is the stub that's going to give you your privacy and your encryption. You also have a special resolver that's on the other side of the local DNS server. And this is called the oblivious DNS resolver. And this is the resolver that's actually going to perform the lookups in the clear to the root server, the TLD server, and the authoritative server. So the operation is that the client is going to have a query, and the stub is going to encrypt the query, and that query is going to get passed to the local DNS server. And the local DNS server doesn't see what the query is. It's encrypted, but it does know to send any response back to this particular client. So it knows who the client is that asks this query. It forwards this query to this resolver, and it's only at the resolver that the query can be decrypted. And at the resolver knows that this local DNS server gave it this request, but this resolver doesn't have the identity of the client that initiated this request. And so here, you have the content of the query, but not the identity. Here, you have the identity of the client, but not the content. So that's the magic here. The Open DNS resolver will then do the query and then get the response back. And the resolver will encrypt this response, pass it back to the local DNS server. The response is not visible to the local DNS server, but the local DNS server knows who it needs to get sent back to. We'll send it back to the stub, and the stub will decrypt it, and then you have your lookup. Okay, so this is actually, because we have done the cryptographic protocol stuff, I'm going to use the same figures that I used earlier to show you the details of how this thing works. So this is the client query with a domain, pdx.edu. So I'm trying to do a lookup of pdx.edu, and then on my machine, I have this stub. And this stub is going to generate a session key in green. And it says, I am going to encrypt this request, this DNS request, with this key and generate the encrypted query. And then what I need to do is I have this open DNS resolver that I want my request forwarded to eventually. And this open DNS resolver has a public key and a private key pair, and it publishes the public key, the blue thing. And then what the client is going to do is going to take this ODNS resolver's public key, and it's going to encrypt the session key or the green key that it generated with the public key. And then it's going to attach both of these two values to a query to the local DNS server. So these two pieces, and this should be familiar to what you have seen before in the protocol section. The local DNS server doesn't know the content of this query, and it doesn't know the key, the encrypt. It can't decrypt this, so it can't decrypt either of those things. This is opaque. This query is opaque for this DNS server, even though it knows who asked for it. So the identity is here, the content is not revealed. The open DNS resolver is going to take this encrypted session key that's been encrypted with its public key, and then decrypt it with the private key, and then regenerates that session key, and then uses that key to decrypt this original request, and then get that this was pdx.edu. And so now the open DNS resolver has this session key that that stub generated, and then it does this lookup. And so this lookup is done just like we did before, and then you get the result. pdx.edu is some IP address, and so that's what comes back from the hierarchy, 131.252.1.1, let's say. And now the open DNS resolver is going to take that result, and it's going to encrypt that result. So this is from the right to the left, and generate the response encrypted with the session key. Sends this back to the local DNS server, and of course, this response is not viewable by this server. And then it goes back all the way back to the stub. And then the client stub has that session key, decrypts this, and then the resolution has happened. So the short of this is that the ODNS resolver knows the domain and the result that was looked up, but not the client, and the local DNS server knows the client, but not the domain or result. And you'll see this exact same pattern happening over multiple hops in Tor. Tor doesn't want this to be just one hop. Tor wants this to be like 3 or 4 hops, but the exact same onion routing principle applies. It's actually using this very, very similar technique. Questions about oblivious DNS? So it's unclear how prevalently this will get deployed and whether governments will start shutting this down. Yeah. Yeah, you don't need to use this. You don't need to use this private key unless you are fearful that someone has captured this session key somewhere and you want some kind of signature that the DNS resolver. But at this point, your trust model is that you trust this resolver and you trust that this key is not being revealed inside the network. So you wouldn't need a signature. You could add a signature if you really cared about that, but for the threat model that you have defined, that Oblivious DNS has defined, it assumes that you have trust in the both the stub and the resolver. Yep, that's correct. Any other questions?
Said this wasn't really deployed yet. Apple just created the.
It's a proposal, and this will work. Like if you do this, this will work. But like whether or not this will be prevalently used is another question. Yep.
Yeah, it's a question like, why would we want it to be prevalently used?
So if you're law enforcement, yeah, you don't want that prevalently used. And this is when we talk about privacy coins, like if you take like cryptocurrency, that they want all of this currency exchange to be anonymous, but that is basically nirvana for criminals, right? And so it's not going to, governments aren't going to allow that. So they'll shut that down. This is similar. You could use this prevalently for hiding criminal activity. And so this is the tension, and this is where policy needs to be involved because the technology is there, right? The technology to make things completely private is there. If it starts getting used mostly for malicious purposes, then for a societal good, the government has to maximize the societal good. They'll be like, okay, the benefit of privacy is outweighed by the fact that we can't do our jobs as law enforcement. That's the take home for all of this stuff. And you see this over and over again. Bitcoin is being allowed because it's easy to trace. The government can actually freeze funds in Bitcoin wallets. They could be like, anytime, I can actually sanction a Bitcoin wallet now as a government and say any transfer of any currency from this wallet is illegal now. And then I can basically allow, because that's what you need to stop criminal activity over a particular piece of technology. You need to be able to identify abuse and disincentivize its continued operation. So oblivious DNS, it's an open question how this is going to be used. Same with DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS. So this is something that's ongoing. It's a policy thing. Okay. So that's DNS. I am going to transition now to the next set of application protocols, which is email. And I'm first going to talk about how the email protocols were developed initially. The first thing to know about email protocols was there were three main ones. Well, actually, there was one main one initially. This is SMTP. And this was basically just a transfer protocol. And it was used by senders to just transmit messages to a mail server. And if you wanted, as a recipient, to get access to this mail, you would connect into a mail server and view the messages on the mail server. And so this was just a protocol. So if you as a client wanted to send an email message, you would use this protocol to submit your message over the internet so that it would get stored at this mail server. It was also, if you were sending mail to someone outside of your domain, it was also the exact same protocol was used to transfer mail to other domains. And so this is using the same protocol as the sender submitted on, and other people in other domains would also use SMTP to get messages back and forth. You would typically, at the beginning, you would actually log in to your mail server and check your messages. But people didn't want to do that all the time to check their messages. And so the other things that got developed to help with this are access protocols, where on a client, you run these mail access protocols. So IMAP is this Internet Message Access Protocol, port 143, and POP, which is the post office protocol. You would run either one of these two protocols to get access to your mail without actually having to log in to that mail server. So these were the three main email protocols that were initially developed. And so access protocols to and from this mail server, initially they started out with IMAP and POP3, and I know some faculty are still using IMAP and POP3 to access their email, because Gmail, for example, allows IMAP and POP3 access to pull messages. If you're using Microsoft Outlook, that's often how you'll access your mail. You have your mail client on your laptop, and then you're going to go directly to the mail exchanger to pull your messages. But this eventually transitioned to web-based email clients. And most of us are doing this. Like when we bring up our mail, it's a tab in a browser now. And this is what it looks like. You are going over the web to some website, and that webmail site is actually running a access protocol to the mail exchanger to get your messages. And this could be any number of protocols. You could use IMAP and POP between the web front end and the mail exchanger, but you don't have to. And I would suspect Google is not doing this on the back end. They're probably doing something faster. Okay, so those are the protocols. There were some assumptions that got made when these protocols were developed. With SMTP, everybody is your friend. You don't need to encrypt messages. You don't need to verify the source or the data integrity of the message. You take everything at face value, believing everyone's going to tell the truth. And then you don't limit the number of messages that you accept. You're like, you're only going to send me messages if you know the reader, the recipient wants to read them. So send whatever you want me to store. And so this asymmetry, basically you send a mail server anything and it's basically going to want to store it for you. And that's a flaw in the design rather than having the sender store the message and have the sender create all the storage costs for the email application. The model was the recipient consumes all the resources on the email application. So that's an issue. Okay, and then with the access protocols, IMAP and POP3 don't encrypt any messages. You can do some authentication for the user's mailbox. So yeah, maybe username and password, but because no one is listening on the network, you can send these things in the clear. So these are the assumptions. And so what could go wrong? Well, a lot of things started going wrong: spam, spear phishing, business email compromise. All of these things are a result of poor email security. Okay, so we'll first start with the confidentiality attacks. And so here's a picture of an SMTP exchange. The blue messages are what the server sends you, and then the black messages are what the client sends. And so I have these preceded by S:, to also denote that this is from the server, and then C: is from the client. So you connect up to port 25, and the SMTP server is going to say, oh, you're connected. I'm running postfix. And you say, oh, these are the messages the client sends to negotiate the transmission of the email. And you can see later on is when the client wants to send the actual email, all of this stuff is done in the clear. So there's no confidentiality in email. Likewise, there's no confidentiality in POP3. You connect up to that port. It's in plain text. It's an ASCII protocol. It says it's ready. You send your username. You send your password. These credentials are also sent in the clear. And then when you start operating on your messages, say, I want to list my messages, I want to retrieve my messages, all of this stuff is done in the clear. I've edited this because it's I didn't want to show you the actual contents. So again, there's no confidentiality in POP3. And there's no confidentiality in IMAP either. You connect up to the IMAP server, you log into this IMAP server, you have your email address and your password sent in the clear. And then when you operate on the IMAP mailbox, these are also in the clear. And I showed you those Wireshark examples where you can see all this stuff in a packet trace if the adversary is listening on the wireless network and you're doing IMAP or POP3 without any support for encryption or confidentiality. Okay, so this leads us to running SMTP, IMAP, and POP3 over TLS. So that was why we have this TLS layer, is because we want to just be able to point our application protocols to TLS and get all the benefits, get the integrity, get the, well, quote unquote integrity. We'll talk about integrity next, but definitely get the encryption, right? We can have an encrypted channel, and then we're going to use these port numbers. So 587, 993, and 995 are the new ports for doing these standard protocols over TLS, and they're the equivalent of things like HTTP over TLS. And so this is a picture of it. So now when Alice sends her message to this mail transfer agent or mail server, she can send it over TLS. And then when Bob retrieves the messages, Bob can also do this over TLS to hide the credentials and the contents. Typically on the back end, you could do things over TLS, or for backwards compatibility, almost every single mail exchanger is going to allow regular SMTP to and from the client. And so the assumption here is that the adversary is not in between the mail exchanger and the mail transfer agent. And so this is the architecture. The mail transfer agent is the sending mail server, and then the mail exchanger is the recipient mail server. And so this is terminology that you'll come across if you ever work with email architectures. Okay, so that gives you confidentiality, at least between the endpoints and the mail exchange or the mail transfer agent. So that solves that problem. What it doesn't solve, though, is what happens if some rogue mail transfer agent decides that it wants to pretend to be Alice. And so this is a legitimate user. And so you have an adversary here that's like, hey, Alice's friend network, I want to sell you Viagra, and make sure it comes from Alice, because you are much more likely to buy it if it came from someone you know. So how do we prevent that? That's very insidious, right? You don't want that to happen on your own email address. And you get this often, right? Like you're like, oh, I didn't send that message. It's doing something I would have never asked you to do, but somebody is sending it as me. And so the big issue with email is email integrity attacks. So let me revisit that SMTP exchange and talk about authenticating clients. So with source integrity, you connect up to this mail server, and one of the first messages you send is, let me identify myself as a relay for some domain, example.org. And the server's like, oh, you know what? I am going to trust you at face value, saying that you speak for example.org because you said so. That's the first mistake in this protocol when it comes to integrity. The next message is like, hey, I have an email from this person, alice@college.edu. And the server's like, oh, good. That must be legitimate. You said that you were sending it on Alice's behalf. I'm just going to believe you. There's nothing else I can do except believe you, because you said so. I'm good with that message. And then you're going to send it to particular people on this mail server. And then the server says, okay, what's your email? Send it in data, followed by a carriage return line feed, a dot on the line by itself, followed by another carriage return line feed. And so then you're like, okay, I'm going to send the payload, the data payload for this email. And that's what the next thing is. And the next thing has another from header that says for the recipient email reader, this email came from Alice. And note that this from doesn't have to match this protocol message, mail from. In this case, it does, but the adversary can be like, oh, you know what? I lied. Up here, I can send it to someone else down here if you wanted to. So there's some confusion here as to what the email server, the recipient, is actually going to use as the identity of the mail sender. That reveals something that can happen. You could have this exact same interaction. The mail from could be some random email address. And then when you get to the payload of the message, you could rewrite this to be something else. And these two things don't have to match. And then the question is, does Bob see the first one or the second one? And does it matter? Because the reader is going to, like, neither one of these is authenticated. So the reader is going to see one or the other, and neither one has been validated as being legitimate. So that's the problem with this thing. And as a result of this lack of source integrity, this is where you get spam, spear phishing, fraudulent email. All of this stuff happens because we don't authenticate the client account, right? We don't have any, SMTP doesn't have any way of validating when you say you're alice@college.edu. It has no idea. It can't validate that at all. And so you could have people on the internet, pretending to be your account, sending you all sorts of stuff through to a victim at company.com. So, and then Bob is going to get all of these messages, and it basically looks like Alice at college.edu. This leads us to these things, these email protocols that are intended to add client authentication. Try and authenticate the sender, because we don't have any of that in our email systems initially. So this is SPF, DKIM, DMARC. These are the ones I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to really talk about the other two, but these are the main ones that will do this email authentication to be able to allow a recipient email server to identify bogus client messages, to try and get some semblance of authentication on the client emails that are coming in. So I'm first going to talk about DKIM. What does this stand for? This is Domain Keys Identified Mail. We talked about DNSSEC as being a way of using the DNS hierarchy to publish public keys that are being used to sign and authenticate legitimate DNS records, right? DKIM is doing the same thing for email messages. You're going to be able to publish public keys associated with the mail server's private key that you're going to then use to sign messages from that domain. And that's how DKIM is going to work. The recipient, because the public key has been published in DNS, the recipient of an email message is going to take that email message, look at the signature attached to that email message, and then use the public key that it got from DNS to validate that signature so that it knows that the authentic mail server signed the message, right? Now, if that user's account got hijacked, then it's signing a bogus message. So like if that user account got phished and some adversary is sending messages, it'll still sign, it'll still have a legitimate signature, but this at least stops for a random mail server from sending messages as a particular domain. Okay, so this is better in a picture. So this is a high-level view of how DKIM works. The first thing I'm going to do is I have a mail domain. So my company domain is my mail domain, and I am going to generate a public key, private key pair. The private key I keep secret at the top, and then I publish the DKIM public key via DNS. Some DNS record is going to have this DKIM key. And it's done the same way as DNSSEC from last class. And then my mail server is going to have access to this private key. And whenever people are using this mail transfer agent to send messages, the mail transfer agent is going to take this private key and sign the messages that come from this domain. And so you're relying on the security of this mail server here so that you're not signing just random stuff, right? And this goes over the internet. And this ends up at the recipient. So this is the recipient email server. It's going to retrieve the public key associated with that domain from DNS. And then it's going to validate the message that has been signed by the sender against this public key. If the public key, if this key matches, so if the signature matches the public key that you retrieve for that particular domain that the email is being sent from, then you can put this in the inbox. And this is done transparently, right? The user doesn't see any of this. This is all between the sending MTA and the recipient MX server. So there's the mail exchanger on the recipient and the transfer agent on the sender. And this allows you to at least authenticate somewhat this client because they have ownership of this private key and they own the DNS record that allowed them to publish the associated public key for this thing. If it doesn't match, then that's where you can send this thing to spam. And that's why like Gmail doesn't have a ton of spam that hits your inbox, because they're like, oh, we're going to at least enforce this, right? And almost all of the sort of the larger web hosting, like mail hosting providers are doing this, right? And that's how they're filtering spam. Okay, questions about DKIM? I'll go through just a little bit of the details, but I don't want to get too, I mean, at the high level, that's all I care about that you see. In the lowest level, it's basically a simple text record that's got your public key in it. So you have a thing that advertises, well, what domain is this public key good for? And there's a syntax of naming your key. And then you're like, oh, this is my DKIM public key. And then that gets advertised everywhere. So here's an example for tel99.com. And then I have, this is redacted, but like this is their public key. And that's very simple in its operation. On the sending end, this is just added as an email header, a DKIM email header. So the sender will just generate that signature from the private key and then just say, oh, this is the signed, my signature on this particular message, and then sends it over to the recipient. Okay, that's all I'm going to cover with DKIM. I don't want to bore you with details of this protocol. So I'm going to go to the next thing, which is another mechanism for authenticating sending the email transmission. And this is the sender policy framework. One of the problems with DKIM is that I might be sending email from a whole bunch of different places on the internet. And we'll see when I show you Portland State, all the different places Portland State sends email from, you're like, I don't want every single one of those places to have a private key to sign messages, because then any one of those machines, if any one of those machines gets compromised, it's like, I might as well not have had DKIM to begin with. So there are other ways of ensuring client authentication. And one of these ways is this sender policy framework, or SPF. And it also uses text records. And the way it uses text records is to advertise a list of authorized IP addresses and domains who can send mail on their behalf. So you're a domain, pdx.edu, and you have a list of addresses and services that you have blessed as being able to send authentic email from pdx.edu. So for example, Canvas email. It's like Canvas email servers are hosted at Instructure's sites, right? Like when they send you an email reminder, like that doesn't come from Portland State Gmail servers or SMTP servers on campus. That comes from Canvas, because that's where all that infrastructure is operating. So you need to allow Canvas to send emails as pdx.edu. And this is what is going to allow this SPF, Sender Policy Framework. And so with this text record, you're advertising all of this stuff. So here's an example of a SPF record. And the SPF record has a syntax with a different set of directives. And so here's an example of some of the directives that are common. The MX keyword says accept mail from the IP address associated with the domain's MX record. And so if I get an email from pdx.edu, I can do a MX lookup on pdx.edu, find the IP address, and if that mail exchanger is also the mail transfer agent for the domain, they're one and the same, I'm going to allow that. And so that's what the MX record is. And this is common if your MTA and your MX are one and the same for an organization. You receive mail on the same server that you send mail to other destinations on. So this is very common in most organizations. The A record says, the A record without anything following it says, I'm going to look up the A record for that domain. So I'm going to look up the A record for pdx.edu, and maybe my web server also is allowed to send email. Say, allow that one, allow the A record. I can say, these other domains that are sending on my behalf, so instructure.com with Canvas, I can add those. Anything that comes from these domains associated with Canvas, I'm going to allow. And then say I have some random servers littering Portland State that also send email. I'm going to allow those. Maybe like the Survey Monkey thing or whatever. I get so many surveys. But the thing that's sending me surveys might be a machine sitting in someone's office. And then like, let me say that IP address is allowed to send email as pdx.edu. And the last thing says, what do I want to do if none of these match, and this says deny all the rest of the messages that you might receive from this domain, to just drop all of them. And that's the last thing. And so as Portland State, I can advertise this handling policy to everybody on the internet. And this allows me to make sure my domain isn't being abused. So this is a way, as the sender, I can also control who gets to see these records. So I actually just explained all of this stuff. Okay, so one of the things about the IPv4 thing, this can be given as a prefix, a CIDR prefix. So that's it's good that we covered CIDR earlier. And then, yeah, allow all senders, which is, yeah, allow everything is like, well, I might as well not even have created an SPF record if I was going to allow everything. But that directive is there. But tilde all says deny all senders. Okay.
Does that record just show up when you do like a who is?
I'll show you Portland State's record. Actually, it's a dig. You do a dig-t on the text records of pdx.edu. You get a whole bunch of site verification records because that's how we do hosting. But then you also get the SPF record, which I'll show you in the next slide. So here's an example. Just want to show you some simple policies. This policy says only the mail exchanger can send email on that domain and then prohibit everything else. Here's one that says the domain should not be sending email at all. Like I should have this for oregonctf.org. because I don't have email addresses associated with that domain. So this is what I would do to keep people from sending email as someone at oregonctf.org. I would say tilde all, just deny everything. Here's another one that says, everything on this subnet allow sending. So on Portland State, say Portland State wanted to allow anybody on campus to send email as at portlandpdx.edu, it could just do 131.252.0.00/16 and say everyone on campus can send email. They don't want that, but this is a policy that allows them to specify that if they did. Here's another one that says, my mailer is very specific. It's mailers.example.com. So allow that, all the IP addresses associated with this name, there could be multiple ones. That's how I'm doing my mail architecture. It's just a set of servers that are responsible for sending, deny everything else. And so with all of these things, here's an example SPF record for one particular domain. And you can see, all right, I'll let the mail exchanger send email. The A record, the website, can send mail. I'm using an SMTP. I'm using a SendMail hosting provider. So, well, no, this is a local server that I am allowing to send mail. And then this is like a third party. So SendGrid is a third party mailer. So if you have mass mail that you want to send, you would typically use a service like SendGrid to bypass all of the filtering and that kind of stuff. So then you're allowing SendGrid to send mails and then a particular IP address. So this is a /32. So this is basically a single IP address that you're allowing to send mail and then denying the rest. So here's Portland State. You do a dig-t on the text records of pdx.edu. You get a whole bunch of stuff, but inside of it, you'll see the SPF record for Portland State. And look at that. Look at how many machines are authorized to send. You could basically do reverse lookups on each one of these IP addresses to figure out which third-party services they belong to. So they've done it by IP address, but I bet you these resolve to services, named services. I haven't actually done the operation of doing the reverse lookup to figure out where all this stuff is coming from, but they do say everybody from the from 131.252 is allowed to send email as at pdx.edu. That will be allowed. Okay, here's one for Gmail. So everything associated with this are Gmail's sending servers. So when you resolve this name using DNS, you'll get the list of Gmail sending IP addresses for their sending servers. Okay, are there questions about SPF? Okay, And leads us to this third thing. It's called DMARC, Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. This is more of a policy thing that's on top of DKIM and SPF. So this is why they encode a policy. And the policy says is how do I want you to handle email messages that are using my domain as a from, but don't match my SPF or my DKIM policy. Here's Portland State. Portland State has a DMARC policy, and then Gmail gets an email from Portland State that doesn't match this policy. What do I do with it? Or doesn't match the DKIM or SPF record. What do I do with it? And that's what DMARC is intended to address. And so, so we have these two mechanisms, DKIM and SPF, for attempting to do client authentication or client validation. DMARC is just saying what are the instructions for Gmail to take when a message from my domain fails the check. And then what it also does is say, how do you want these failures to be reported? So if someone is attempting to basically impersonate a whole bunch of Portland State accounts to Google, Portland State wants to know, right? And DMARC allows Portland State to say, you know what, any failure, send back to me using a particular email address. So that's the reporting part of it. And this allows you to get some intelligence on how your domain is being used in the internet. Okay, so there are three options for failed email checks. You could do nothing, which is basically what we have right now. It's like, just let it through. And so there's like no checks. Or like, I have a DMARC policy that says don't do anything. That's kind of a useless policy, but it is encoded. And so, for example, if you deploy DMARC and all of a sudden it's breaking, then maybe you would advertise none until you figure out what's going on. So that's what none is. This doesn't mean that all of a sudden your messages will end up in people's inbox, because then the email provider can run something else to detect spam. It's not just going to use DKIM and SPF only. It's also going to use content filtering to detect spam. The other thing is quarantine. You don't allow this thing to hit the inbox of a user. It can be sent to the spam folder, or it can be held until someone looks at it and then delivered after someone sees and approves it. And then the last thing is reject, discard it if it fails to check. The other part of DMARC is that you can allow DMARC to advertise that you want all of the reports of failed messages to be sent back to a particular email address that you own. And this allows a domain to really analyze what's going on with its domain. So here is an example record. It says DMARC1, I want you to reject messages that don't fit the DKIM or SPF criteria. And then I want you to mail all the summary responses for these rejected messages to these email addresses. And this allows you to get notified for what's going on with your domain. Okay, so this is a picture of what's going on in the recipient email server. So now you have a message that comes from the sender, so from domain.com, it goes to the receiving email. And now the receiving email is going to check the SPF record to figure out the IP addresses that are associated with this email domain, and then the sender MTA. And if they match and the SPF is correct, then you're like, oh, this is SPF aligned. I can be assured that this is coming from the right set of IP addresses. And then the same thing with the signature. If I have the email and then I check the DKIM signature, I can see if the DKIM is correct and say this is DKIM aligned as well. And then if it's not, then I can reject this. And then I would use the DMARC policy to figure out, do I drop it? Do I let it through? Who do I send the notifications to on the other side? Okay, so there's a picture of everything put together, published the DMARC record to DNS. So the DMARC record includes SPF and DKIM keys. This is all done as one. So the policy, the SPF, and the DKIM are all done in one DMARC record. And then this gets published to your DNS server. And then the sender is going to send email, and then the recipient is going to check SPF, check DKIM, check DMARC, apply the policy, so reject, put it in the inbox or quarantine, and then send reports back to the sender. And that's how email is being secured in this day and age. You need to have these pieces in place to do this. Are there questions about?
So it actually reports back to like the, I don't know, like PDF.
Yeah. So I don't know if we have a DMARC record, actually. I didn't even look for a DMARC. I was like, oh, I'll show the SPF, but I didn't actually do the DMARC record because there's so much other stuff in our text records at Portland State. But hey, we could try. I have time.
So that's basically us advertising our policy to people like Gmail.
Yep.
Saying, what would you like us to do if somebody impersonates you?
Yep, that is exactly it. So I think it's pretty elegant. It's just take some configuration. So I should do a dig-t on the text record of pdx.edu. I'll have to put this to less because there's so much stuff in our text record. This is for Google Sites hosting that we show that we own their domain. So there's Google, Facebook, Apple. This is a domain verification for DNSSEC. And then this is our SPF record. Oh, so we don't have a DMARC record at Portland State, and we don't have a DKIM signing key. So all we're doing is SPF for client authentication. And I think maybe after class, I'm gonna do a reverse lookup on all of these things and just see what else we have here. Just for fun. Like some of these are, I bet you there's a Canvas one. What else do we get notifications from that are a third party? Well, we already have Google, but yeah, it would be interesting. I might do this after class and post it on the channel just to do. Well, this is kind of, so this, when you do the DNS intelligence stuff, this is what you would do. So this isn't part of your DNS intelligence labs, but like you could do this kind of hacking, or I mean, you could call this hacking, but just basically open source intelligence to figure out how our infrastructure is laid out. And if you see a provider, say an adversary is in on any one of these organizations that show up in this SPF record, well then if their eventual target is Portland State, then they can go through one of these folks to get at us. Like say they wanted to phish someone at Portland State very badly, then if they could get any machine on any of these ranges, then they're good. They're good to go. And actually, probably the easiest one to get is this, because like, yeah, this encompasses all the student machines, right? Like, so maybe faculty machines. Faculty are probably less secure than students, actually, to be honest. Yeah, that's a huge target. And then you could send as pdx.edu. So yeah, there is some assumptions here. And so this actually, because we have a guest network, and if the guest network brings you an IP address that's 131.252, you can send messages from people at portlandstate.edu that pass this check.
So just, for like a desktop computer connected to mail server, like is it very easy?
Oh yeah, you can, it's just a protocol. You could be the mail transfer agent. This laptop can speak SMTP to any mail server. So yeah, there's nothing special about an MTA. We typically separate it off of the client machine, but there's no reason why the client machine couldn't be the server sending the messages. Yeah. So that's all I'm going to cover for network security. That was kind of a sprint, but hopefully I gave you the highlights of what goes on in the network layer. I'm going to now talk about host security issues. So the next part of this is just what can happen on a host after an adversary gets onto it. I'm going to first talk about the attacks, and then I'm going to talk about some of the prevention measures. And this is a cash cow for both. Well, the prevention parts of it are a cash cow, but in order to talk about what each one of these different product things are doing, I have to talk about what does an adversary do when they're on your machine. So that's what this thing is. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the attack lifecycle. In other classes, I covered this thing called the MITRE attack framework, and it's basically a classification of what an adversary will do when they get onto a machine in your enterprise. And these are typical, like they do a bunch of incident response activities, and they say, well, these are the things the adversary did, and they're like, it's a repeating pattern everywhere. And they're like, let's classify it so we can name these things so that we can then reason about this better. And that's really important in order for you to abstract out what's going on from the adversary so you can defend it. And so humans like doing that. So this is shown best in a figure. And I'm going to use this figure and I'm going to revisit each one of these steps to talk about, well, what does each one of these steps look like when it comes to an adversary? So the first thing is the initial compromise. I find some way to get onto a host in that enterprise. And then when I'm on that host, one of the things I will look to do is escalate my privileges. Say I get in on that machine as a regular user, I need to up my privilege level so I can get better access to the enterprise on the back end. I would love to get root access or domain access, complete domain access as an administrator in this domain, but I don't start with that. I might have a low-level engineer's account, and I want to escalate myself to something else. As part of privilege escalation, maybe I want to look around the enterprise. I want to scan resources. I want to figure out if there's something in the file system that's useful for me or in memory. I can figure out what processes are running, what connections are there, trying to do some internal reconnaissance. And then once I've done some internal reconnaissance, I can start moving around the enterprise. And this is what the moving laterally means. I can just go from this machine to the next one over, to the next one over, all the way up until I can get something really valuable on that enterprise. And then I would like to persist across all of this, right? And this is not necessarily sequential. This could all be done at the same time. But this loop is basically everything the adversary is doing while they have access to your machine. They're trying to do all of this all at the same time. And so we need to see what this is, what all these activities engender in order for us to do any kind of protection. And then the last thing is actions on objectives. Like, hey, I'm here for a reason. And if it's a nation state, there are very clear reasons why they're on your machine trying to get stuff. Or if it's a criminal, there are very clear reasons for a criminal to be on in your enterprise and what they're looking for. And so the last part is just to complete your objectives. And this is really helpful to like, well, figure out what the adversary really wants out of your enterprise so that you can protect that thing as the most important thing. Okay, so we're gonna walk through just briefly, give you the kinds of things that happen on the host at a pretty high level. I will dig a little bit deeply on some of the exercises that I'm gonna have you do in the lab section for this part, and that's mostly focused on the privilege escalation part of this thing. Yeah, I think with the Nmap stuff that you were doing, that covers the internal recon pretty well. But yeah, most of this week's labs are in the escalate privileges part. So I'm going to talk about the very specific ways you're going to escalate privileges that happen in the labs. Okay, so the first thing is initial compromise, and there are many vectors for an adversary to get their initial access onto a machine. And this is something you should always assume has happened. With the castle moat model, you're like, oh, I have this strong outer shell. Nobody's going to get on the inside. And that got blown up. Like if Google can get hacked like they did in 2010, it's like, what chance do the rest of us have? And so the idea is to always assume that the adversary has a foothold somewhere in your organization. And at Portland State, that's a pretty good assumption to have because you're never going to protect all the machines that people are bringing onto campus and connecting up to Portland State's network. So compromise credentials, social engineering. So Travis just posted that phishing, the duo phishing. That's very effective. I bet you someone in this organization fell for it. And then they have a machine that is on the network. You could have a malicious insider. So this is what one of the things that almost happened to Tesla is somebody offered an engineer like $1 million for their corporate credentials. And it's like for $1 million, and like for a nation state, that's like, whatever, it's $1 million. I'll just sell another barrel, a couple thousand barrels of oil. If it's Russian, I'm assuming it was, actually, I think it was a Russian agent. You're like, that works, right? Like that works. It's like, maybe I'll I would definitely give up my Portland State credentials for $1 million, actually. I would do that. And then if you are at a high enough, if you are at a sensitive enough level, yeah, anybody can get turned for that amount. I would do it for much cheaper than that, but that's just me. So malicious insider or someone who's just desperate for money on the inside, that's something that happens. You can trick the user into opening up an attachment, executing malware. And this is what that malware reverse engineering class is about. It's very sneaky how stuff gets through. And then once you get that user to execute something, then you have actions that you can perform as an adversary. The fourth one is binary exploitation and application vulnerabilities. We're going to talk about binary exploitation in the next section. Application vulnerabilities, most of these are web application vulnerabilities that get covered in the 495, 595 class next quarter. So I'm gonna avoid covering too many of those. Okay, so that's the initial compromise. The next thing I want to focus on is privilege escalation. So the idea is once you're on a machine, you have a regular user account, you need additional privileges to get at really sensitive data on that enterprise. And so if you're on, for example, if your foothold is on a Linux system, then there are a whole bunch of different things you can do on that Linux system to become administrator. And the adversary is going to figure that out. They're going to get onto that system, figure out the versions of software you have running on that, and then look for vulnerabilities that they can actually utilize. And some of them are what I'm going to describe next. One class of vulnerabilities that allows an adversary to escalate their privileges is to find vulnerable setuid programs. We covered setuid programs before. If you have the setuid bit set on your binary, allowing people to become you, and there's a vulnerability in that binary that allows an adversary to execute code of their choosing using your privileges, then they have full execution as you. And so if it's a setuid root program and it's got a vulnerability, adversary is done, right? They got root access. And that happened. This happens all the time.
Yeah, I think I showed you the website, the like GTFO bins or something.
Yeah.
There were just hundreds of these.
So GTFO bins is a very interesting site for finding things. So I think it's like get the F out is the GTFO acronym. But yeah, these are things that you can like, hey, I have established access to this machine. This is all the version of the kernel, version of the libraries, the version of the binaries. What can I do to escalate my privileges? And then that's an easy operation to basically get these privileges. And so for a while, for 9 years actually, well, I don't know if this was ever published. It was probably used by a bunch of people and kept quiet. There was and sudo, that's a big one to have a flaw in because this just basically runs anything as root. So this is your key onto any system to get elevated privileges. And this was done as a buffer overflow, a stack overflow exploit, which we'll do a little bit of next week, just to show you why C is something you should avoid writing your programs in from now on. So this was buffer overflow bug, and it basically overflows the password buffer. The thing that sudo was using to read in the password wasn't bounds checked appropriately. And you get this seg fault, and then anytime you see a seg fault, adversaries can turn memory corruption. You give an adversary 1 byte of memory corruption, and it's been shown again and again that adversaries can turn that into, good ones can turn that into remote code execution. They can chain that with a whole bunch of other stuff and then get remote code execution, which is what this CVE resulted in, code execution as root. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Another way is to exploit these vulnerable command and library paths. And we covered this earlier when I covered Linux. There are multiple environment variables that control where you get your software from in the shell. So one of them is the path environment variable. It's an ordered sequence of directories that your shell searches to figure out where a particular program you want to execute should be run from. And so if you manage to put the current directory in someone's path, then you can drop a binary in that path and then cause them to execute that version of your program. LD library path is another environment variable. This says, what is the ordered sequence of directories that I should look for dynamic libraries to load into my, my program? Because when you compile a program in C, you don't want to statically include all the libraries that you depend upon. You want the loader to go search the file system for those libraries. And the LD library path is one of the things that it can use to find the libraries that it depends upon. And if you hijack that, you can also get remote code execution as an adversary. So, and that's what happens. There's another environment variable called LD preload. You can get programs to preload certain sets of libraries before they load anything else. And so if you add an LD preload to malicious libraries before someone executes a regular command, it'll execute that regular command, but they won't know that the rogue library got loaded before they executed that command. So these are all things that have been exploited to elevate privileges on Linux. This is not something that's ancient history. I don't have all the examples of this. I think in the malware class, I have more examples of all three of these things. So here's an example that I'll walk through. You have a root account, and the root account has the current directory in LD library path. So this shouldn't happen actually, but it's just say it does. Then if the adversary plants a malicious library in /temp, and then the root user is navigating into /temp running programs, then if the adversary plants that malicious library in LD library path, the command that gets executed by root in /temp will pick up that malicious library instead of the legitimate one that it had intended to load. And then you get code execution. So this path confusion thing is something that, that can happen. Another set of very common vulnerabilities are race conditions. And for here, there's a very common acronym that's used to describe race conditions. And these are the time of check to time of use of races. So TOC, TOU. And these are prevalent in any system that has multiple processes and multiple cores running at the same time, which is basically every system. Even your phone is like that, multiple cores, like 6 or 7 cores on that thing. And if you don't pay attention to the fact that concurrency is happening all the time, you could be writing your single process, single threaded program thinking that that only one thread of execution is happening, and the adversary can get in there and modify some of the assumptions that you're making in your program underneath. And so this is where adversarial thinking and thinking about concurrency really matters when you're designing things to be race-free. So one of the examples that we're going to walk through is that the victim can check the properties of a resource, like a file, at a particular name, and this is the check time. And then before the victim goes and uses that resource, the adversary changes it underneath. And then when the victim uses the resource, the victim thinks that it passed the check, but because the resource is something different, then the victim is forced to use the malicious resource instead. So this is a flow chart. Say the program wants to open a file, temp user file, only if it's not a symbolic link, right? So it's like, I'm going to open this up if it's a regular file, but if it's a symbolic link, I'm going to quit. And so then the attacker's like, okay, I'm going to create this regular file. And then the program runs, and the program uses the system call to see what kind of file is temp user file. And it's like, oh, it is a regular file. I'm going to be like, fine, it passes the check. I can use it. and that's the time of check. And then the attacker's like, oh, okay, well, it passed the check. I'm going to quickly unlink the file, just remove it. This unlink is the system call for removing a file in Unix. And then I'm going to create a symbolic link that points this file to etc shadow. And then the program is like, oh, well, it was a regular file. I'm going to open it, even though I didn't want to open it if it was a symlink. It's a symlink now, and I'm going to open it. And then I have the time of use. The file is different than the time of check. And then the program uses etc shadow. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'm going to fix one thing in this next slide before I go through it. Sorry, I made a mistake on this next one. Okay. So here's another example that I'm going to cover. And this is the X11 domain socket race conditions. What is this? So X11 is the windowing system for Linux. Well, one of the windowing systems for Linux. One of the things that it needs to do is communicate into a socket any of the windowing events. And it does this by creating a temporary directory, a temporary directory in /temp to do this. And so you want this, if there's a directory that already exists for X11, it's gonna remove that directory or move it somewhere else and create a new one for all of these messages to communicate. Because if you had an X11 session, you quit out of it, and then or it crashed, and you wanted to start up another X11 session, you need to create a new directory and move the old one off somewhere else. Now, because X11 is dealing with the device itself, it needs to have privileged access. Like, it's got to be owned by a privileged user. And so here is a vulnerability. It's a race condition on the setup of this X11 directory. And so as a victim, you can be like, oh, you know what? I need to create this directory, /temp X11 Unix. I want to see whether or not this directory exists and whether or not it's executable. If so, I have a stale version, and then I'll move it. I'm going to move it somewhere else. And then I'm going to be like, I am going to create a new directory, the new version, and then I'm going to change its permissions to be privileged because this now needs to be, it needs to interact with the hardware. So this is the process for doing so, and then I'm done. So this thing where it's creating the directory, changing its owner to root, and then changing the permissions, you would like all of these operations to be done atomically. But this is a multi-core system, multiple processes going on. The adversary is sitting there navigating the file system, trying to get stuff done. This doesn't hold. And so the question is what happens if a link is created pointing to etc shadow just before this makedir happens? What happens if I create a symbolic link from etc shadow to this socket directory, and then this makedir will fail, and then the change ownership will happen, and then the permissions will be wide open on etc shadow? So that is not good, right? The adversary has now tricked the root account into changing the permissions of etc shadow to be readable by everyone. Okay, that's another race condition. So you can kind of see how these race conditions work. So with that, I'm going to cover Dirty Cow. So this is one of your labs. So this is on the Try Hack Me room. One of the things I like about Try Hack Me is anytime there's a new vulnerability, somebody creates a room that allows you to exploit it just for fun. And so I went through and found some host vulnerability labs. And this Dirty Cow one is a race condition. And it's a race condition in how the kernel does its memory mapping. And I just want to explain, there's not going to be in it. So this is not going to show up on a test on the exam or anything. I just want to give you a flavor for a race condition in the kernel, just to show you how easy it is for race conditions to occur that cause privilege escalation in the kernel. And so these images come from a write-up that these two folks did. And I'm going to go through an animation of Dirty Cow. It's a very complex bug, but hopefully this animation allows you to figure out what's going on. Okay, so here we have a Dirty Cow program. It's trying to exploit a race condition to write into a root-owned file, like a root read-only file. It's an unprivileged program, and it's trying to exploit a race condition in the kernel, so this is your operating system, to overwrite in physical memory some file owned by root. And this should definitely not happen. You don't want to do this. But it's going to use tricks in the virtual memory mapping to create mappings into actual memory that confuse the kernel into writing something from this process into that root file when it shouldn't. So that's the setup. The first thing that happens is that the Dirty Cow program asks the operating system to map a writable private copy of this sensitive file into its address space. So say it has just read-only access to this, but it wants to create a file that it can modify in memory. And this is allowable. It's just that when you want to write it out, so sort of like if you pull up Etsy password, you can read it and it creates a temporary file. You can edit it in Vim, but when you want to store it out, it has to go somewhere else. But temporarily, that version of the file of Etsy password that you edited is sitting there in memory, right? And that's basically what this process is doing. You're mapping the read-only file into memory. You're allowing someone to edit it, but you're not allowing them to write it back out. The way this works is that the kernel's like, oh, you know what? Okay, I'll create this mapping for you. I'll say, I am going to take the original version of this file, and I'm going to create a mapping that is your private copy. And this is allowable. You're like, that's your private copy. The only thing about this is that I have this policy, this copy on write policy. And this is where the cow comes from. I'm like, you know what? I actually don't need to make a copy right now. Because right now, when you open up that thing, it's like it's identical, right? The root file and the mapping, because you haven't edited it yet, they're the same. So I'm going to be lazy. I'm going to not do the copy until you write to it. And this is very typical in operating systems, right? Like I'm not going to create that thing until the last minute. And so the copy on write policy says, all right, well, I'm going to create this mapping, but I'm going to have you, I'm going to create this in virtual memory, but the actual physical backing store is still going to be this root file because you haven't changed this thing yet. I don't need to create that copy. And then the kernel has to keep track of the fact that this mapping points to this, but if it gets edited, it needs to go somewhere else. Okay. So this private mapping is in the Dirty Cow memory space. The Dirty Cow program is going to find a way to write to this mapping in a non-traditional way. If it actually wrote the traditional way, things worked fine. And the assumption was it wasn't going to go directly into virtual memory and write directly into virtual memory. And so that's where the bug is. The bug is within this implementation of direct write access to this virtual memory file. And so this is what happens. Dirty Cow says, I want to write moo to this mapping. And this is where the kernel's like, okay, you want to do this right? Now I'm going to have to do the copy on write. So this is what the root, the kernel is doing. So the copy on write forces the kernel to say, all right, I have to create this another copy of this file for your private mapping because you decided to write something into it. This operation takes a lot of time. And this is where the race condition is. Because in the meantime, the Dirty Cow program's like, you know what? I didn't need that after all. I did not need that mapping after all. I was like, I wrote to it, but I'm like, nah, don't need it anymore. And so advise don't need. This causes the kernel to release this private mapping in physical memory. Now it's like, it's making this copy, but the write is sitting here queued up because after the copy is done, it needs to write to that private mapping. But then underneath, Dirty Cow says, just kidding, didn't want it, release this thing. And it does. There's a race now. There's a race between when this finishes and when this gets deleted. If the delete happens first, or if the delete of this file happens first, then the storage of the change will go to the root file instead of the other one. So that's what you get to do. That's your, that's the program. In fact, you can actually, when you get into that room, you'll see this program. And so that's what happens. That's the last part of the animation. So yeah, when you get into that room, you'll be like, you'll overwrite that kernel file. This is the program you'll bring up. So when you get into the room and you compile the program, you take a look, and that's basically what this code is. Very simple program, and then it gets you elevated privileges. And so this is the kind of stuff that's in that GTFO bins that Travis mentioned earlier. And so it's just a matter of looking them up. Like, you're not going to come up with all these CVEs. The penetration testers, like, I need to just be able to look up what are the vulnerabilities associated with any of these versions so that I can win. And that's what you'll be doing. Okay. The other vulnerability I'm going to have you do. Do I have? Oh, I don't have time to finish this one. That's 5 minutes. All right. Next class, I'm going to talk about Dirty Pipe, which is the other lab that does privilege escalation. It does something differently than a race condition. It's basically just an operating system bug. So I'll come back to that next week.
Can I just ask, like, what's a good place to see these CVEs? Is there like a just...
Yeah, CV. So if you click on this, I believe this site is the blessed. Yeah, CVE MITRE, MITRE.org handles all of those things. But actually, Twitter and yeah, these so all of these independent companies have write-ups to actually understand how these CVEs work. You're typically going through Twitter and blogs. For companies that have discovered it and have reported the CVE, they'll usually have a write-up, and maybe it's part of the CVE that a link to the write-up exists, but that's where you can get more information on how the thing works.